Hello and welcome to Boston Media Theory. I'm Marcus Breen. It's great to have you here. And this is a program, for those who've seen it before, you know, but for those who are new, where we look at and discuss with all manner of people from around Boston and Massachusetts, but mostly Boston, people who are engaged in some kind of media activity, maybe academics, researchers, consultants, and indeed poets, anybody who has a contribution to make that we think has a value to add to our discussion of life and work in the media scape, as it were. And tonight I'm delighted to welcome Michael Liu to the show. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you for having me.
I could call you Dr. Liu, but I know you don't want me to say that, so I won't call you Dr. Liu. But welcome, and I'm particularly happy to say, and perhaps a little bit shamefacedly, that you're the first Chinese guest in the history of this show, so this is great. And I'm hopeful that we can have more people talking about and sharing their experiences of what it's like to be Chinese in Boston. So today I want to talk a little bit about being an activist in Boston, particularly around Chinatown, which has been some of your work, and also talk about the experiences that you've had as a Chinese person here. So the first question I wanted to ask you is a little bit unusual, but I wanted to simply, if you like, put things on the table and say, well, what's it like being Chinese? What's it like being in that minority in this city and in this country?
Well, the Chinese community for large part of its history has been seen as marginal to mainstream society in the United States. And so there's an element of invisibility that I think a lot of young Chinese Americans and Asian Americans are fighting against right now. Mm-hmm. Today, but alongside that invisibility has been the times when they have been visible has been a lot of hostility, and that's actually been true up until more or less the end of the Second World War, and things have improved somewhat. But of course now we have the tension between U.S. and China, and so things, who knows what's going to happen in the future.
Yes, well, it was a very tough history of the Chinese exclusion law. What was that, 1890, or was it earlier than that?
It began in 1882.
1882?
Yes.
And that was flat out just racist, wasn't it?
Well, it was the only law that has ever excluded a nationality, by name, one single nationality.
Right.
Yes.
And the Chinese generally have made a significant contribution with their labour. Yes. To the United States, I think, along with the Irish people,
yes,
who are often the labour force.
Yes, I think it was primarily the Chinese labor and Irish labor that built the Transcontinental Railroad. Primarily Irish coming from the east, and the Chinese coming from the west. And the Transcontinental Railroad was so significant to the history of the United States because it pulled together for the first time the country continentally. Unfortunately, at the expense of the Native Americans, but it united and fulfilled, the historic concept of manifest destiny in the United States. Mm-hmm. Actually, before they were able to build that railroad, actually it was easier for the West Coast to get supplies from Hong Kong than from Eastern United States. It was quite difficult. To connect the two coasts.
One of the leading proponents of communication in the United States was a Professor James Carey, and one of the arguments that he made, which didn't require too much argumentation, was that the railroad and then the telegraph, then the telephone, were those communication technologies that made the nation possible.
Yes. The
nation of the United States. So you could, in fact, imagine the continental United States, once it was contained, as it were, within the railway lines and within the telegraph, then you could have a nation.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense.
It does, yes. And so the railroad was part of a nation-building project,
right,
without a doubt. In fact, I suppose, although I don't want to go off topic, it's also part of a nation-building project in China now, isn't it?
Yes,
a very extensive railroad system. What is the sense or do you think there's a sense or much of a difference between someone like you who's been here for all your life and then newcomers to the United States who are coming from China? That seems to me to be maybe two different categories of people and different attitudes.
Yes, I think for a lot of immigrants, they always feel like they're, well, they're not always, I think, but for a long time they feel like their status is tenuous. And whereas those who were born here, who are native, feel more a sense of that they have a greater sense of that they have rights. Equal to or approximately equal to other citizens in the United States, which is actually one reason why actually there was, after the Civil Rights Movement, there was a movement of Asian American activists parallel to the Black Power movement that succeeded the Civil Rights Movement. Primarily led by American-born Chinese to demand equal rights in the United States.
So can you remember any of the names of those people? Those activist Chinese who were engaged in that rights movement?
Well, actually, so that was actually part of my transition.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
So you would consider yourself part of that movement?
Yes, yes.
Well, that's a nice segue into activism.
Yes.
Then, isn't it? So you saw the Black Power movement,
yes.
and the Civil Rights movement, and you said, well, what can be achieved in the struggle for equality?
Well, I have to say I was more inspired by other. Like for instance, my brother was very very active, and my younger brother, and preceded me. A lot of it was catalyzed by opposition to the Vietnam War. So we were part of that that generation. But from that transition into for him doing community work, and I saw that he dropped out of school, and he joined a lot of young. Young people in terms of opening, opening a storefront in Chinatown to provide services. Because in those days, there were very little services in the Chinatowns. I mean, it goes back to what I was saying earlier about those communities being overlooked. For instance, in Boston Chinatown, where I grew up, there were no services, no multi-service organizations, health clinics or anything like that, except for things that were associated with religious organizations, because that was part of their missionary role. So one of the first things that a lot of activists did was to create a lot of service organizations for youth to teach English, to provide health care, to help translate, because previous to that there was very little. Anyway, so a lot of these American-born were part of the cohort that created the service organizations and the advocacy organizations and the organizations that exist in the Chinatowns today. Came out of that period. If you go look at the history, they all came out of the 60s and 70s.
Oh, that's fascinating. So it's somewhat ironic that this was happening at the time of the Vietnam War.
Yes.
So organising and structuring sort of activities for, if you like, claiming equality.
Yes.
While the United States is bombing the daylights out of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, and
right,
and in a very racialised way,
right,
addressing people there very badly. So, what would you say now is the predominant experience of Chinatown in Boston? Because there's a Chinatown in most major cities, right? So, what's unique? Maybe let's start back up a little. Let's ask what's unique about Boston's Chinatown.
Well, actually, there were dozens of Chinatowns in the eastern United States after the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, they were formed because, along with the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, there was a campaign of violence against Chinese. People are not aware, actually, that the largest single act of lynching in the United States happened in Los Angeles when 15 Chinese were lynched, as well as a few others shot in a riot against Chinese, which is happening all over the West. And so that a lot of the Chinese actually took the railroad to the east, and they formed these Chinatowns. And most of the Chinatowns actually, and so they struggled along, again, as I mentioned, they were somewhat marginal, and they faced hostility, but they struggled along until the post-World War II period, when between the combination of the federal highway interstate construction and the urban renewal legislation, those two initiatives are known to have targeted communities of color. But for Chinatowns, it wiped out most of the Chinatowns. You could say Columbus, Ohio, Providence, Rhode Island, Detroit, Michigan, Baltimore, Maryland. All those Chinatowns were gone. And so Boston is unique in that it still exists. You know, it's one of several, and it's also one of the, along with the Chinatowns being somewhat marginal, they were forced to move several times, most of the Chinatowns. But Boston and New York are one of the few that have stayed in the same place from where people originally settled. And I think Boston is a little bit unique in this. Part of why it was able to survive is that it developed a very activist history to try to preserve the community. Yes.
So you were connected to that, and what's your sort of sense of how that's developed?
Over time, I think that partly what I was trying to write about was about how the community kind of learned to gather enough power and figure out a strategy in order for it to survive over the decades. And so, so that was basically, so it was a struggle. And over time, Chinatown, for all practical purposes, the land area has shrunk.
Oh, yeah.
But the population has remained fairly constant because the population goes up. The
buildings go up.
Buildings go up, right. Yeah. So they all used to live in like 3 or 4 story row houses, which were actually, because Chinatown in Boston was primarily an area built for immigrants. And actually Irish people, Italians, Eastern Europeans preceded them. And the immediate predecessor were Syrians and Lebanese. So part of the area that's Chinatown today used to be called Little Syria in Boston.
No, really? Yeah, Little Syria?
Yeah.
Wow. Goodness. And now it's been Chinatown for how long, do you know?
Well, basically, I would say since the end of the World War II.
Right. Yeah. Now you are not just talking off the top of your head here. You're a formally recognised researcher.
Yes.
So you brought a book here. One of more than you've written more than one book, but there's one of them that it's called what Forever Struggle.
Yes.
Right. And this, as it says, traces the history of Chinatown from 1880 to 2018. Is that right?
Right. Yeah. So Chinatown has been here for quite a while, and as I implied, like it's had there was antagonism, and actually the city made various attempts at many times to actually get rid of Chinatown. For instance, it started on Harrison Avenue. I don't know if the viewers are familiar with the streets in Chinatown, but it was a semi-industrial area. It's landfill actually that was actually built for the railroads. Oh. So there was elevated streetcars along a beach and then went down Harrison. Anyway, so the Chinese started on Harrison Avenue, and on one side Harrison Avenue, and since it was a commercial area, the city decided to expand the street, but they decided, for example, to try to take only the side that had the Chinese living, but what happened was that the Chinese just rebuilt the buildings, but they were just shorter, so they stayed.
They stayed.
Yeah.
Very good. There is a sense in listening to you now and well, just knowing a little bit of the history of the United States, which is fundamentally a racist history, of the kind of continuation of different types of terror that are directed at minorities, not least of which are African Americans and Chinese people. And I wanted to just move a little bit from the Chinatown, Boston parochial view, if you like, to this very large perspective now with this new Trump administration in 2024, and get a sense of where, if you have a sense at all, where this is moving, how you feel things are moving, because I know you're associated with promoting friendship between US and China, and we've had a colleague from the association on here before. What do you get the sense of, the changing dynamics of the possibility for coexistence and for, if you like, non-racist interactions between the US and China? I know that's a big question and lots of things there, but any thoughts?
Well, I've had a lot of thoughts. I'm not sure I've had a lot of conclusions. I think it's very complex. I mean, the situation obviously of Chinese and Asians today is different from the 19th century. And I mean, one thing that, for instance, Boston Chinatown has learned has become more a part of the city, has developed allies with other communities. And so I think the situation of the Chinese community, and obviously people live outside of Chinatown today and have more interaction.
So we don't want to sort of create this impression that there's some sort of ghetto that lives there. No, I mean there's tremendous development amongst Chinese people generally.
Right,
Yeah.
but I think for there's a tendency on a lot of people to still see, not everybody, but a lot of people in the United States to still see Chinese as foreign, and so they associate Chinese through the perspective of U.S.-China relations.
Okay.
And so if there's tension between U.S. and China, that's inevitable. So for instance, a clear example was COVID. When COVID was seen as an epidemic that started in China, then there were attacks upon Chinese that living here in the United States. Yeah. People, attacked on the street, pushed in front of
trains,
trains,
subways,
and so on.
Yeah.
And so I think for people, so I think that still continues today. But on the other hand, I think that other people are more enlightened and have had a broader view of the world. Obviously, the world is smaller. People travel and visit China. And then you may have also followed all the controversy around TikTok. And apparently, that's led to the migration of a lot of American or U.S. influencers going on to the Red Note app, but through that process, they've actually compared their countries, their daily lives with each other, and they've actually had conversations where they've had a greater understanding, deeper understanding of each other. And they say, and for the most part, from what I've seen, I mean, I'm not a big social media person, but they say that the Chinese on the whole on this Red Note app have been very welcoming to these TikTok refugees. And so that's involved hundreds of thousands of people. So I'm very hopeful about that. But on the other hand, in the dominant media elites, the elites in Washington have a very it's a uniformly negative, paint a negative picture about China. And as a consequence, I think it makes people very nervous. In fact, there was a Chinatown, he's a union worker who's actually just acquitted. I just read in the paper today he was acquitted of spying for the for China.
Right.
And I think a lot of scientists or people who are in professions in academia are under a lot of suspicion if they travel to China. And so there's been a lot of people that have been ousted from different positions because of those associations. So there's some nervousness, I would say.
Some nervousness, yes.
Yeah.
And of course, on the other hand, there's no indication that China as a major power is going to continue to be a major power. And so we in the United States and the rest of the world has to get used to the fact that there's a new player in town, has been for a while now, but it takes a while to educate people, doesn't it, to what has now just, as of I think last week or very recently, been referred to as a multipolar world.
Yes.
That the unipolar world, where the US was the hegemon and the dominant power, is no longer guaranteed. And the Secretary of State, I think it was Marco Rubio, said, look, it's a multi-power world and a multipolar world. Maybe it's multi-power too. And, you know, we'll have to adjust. So that's a change.
Oh, well, I'm glad he said that. I mean, I think it's very hard. I think, you know, for us here in the United States to adjust the view that we're part of, you know, one among many other nations, and that you can't expect when you go overseas that everybody speaks English and, you know, has the same attitudes as you, and that you have to, you know, learn other ways of looking at the world, and, you know, adjust your values maybe to at least while you're there to, you know, and treat other countries, you know, with some respect. Yeah.
Well, yes, and it's a very steep learning curve.
Yes.
To actually learn how to respect other countries, I think,
Yes.
certainly for the elites, as you suggest.
Yes.
And I suppose we can also see that there's going to have to be, or there will be, some kind of change in the media coverage of China and the way that the transformations, if you like, of funding for USAID, which seem to be underway, are going to change some of the prejudicial, hopefully some of the prejudicial reporting and coverage of China. So that might be something that will be fascinating to watch.
Yes. Well, hopefully. I mean, some of it's become, I think it's been quite difficult. It's just like, you know, as you know, all the recent episode around artificial intelligence,
Yes.
and the realization that maybe we're not as far ahead of China and the rest of the world as we thought, you know, and so we have to adjust how we look at things. That we had assumption that, you know, on a certain level, we had the most advanced understanding and technologies, you know, in the whole world, and maybe not, and maybe we should collaborate more.
That's right. I'm particularly fond of the Chinese idea of win-win, and I think it's possible that it's really hard for people in the West to think that both sides can win because you got to have a winner, right?
Right.
And this is a whole new philosophy, isn't it, really?
Right. Well, and also I think that it's a good thing. I mean, there's been a lot of criticism here in the United States too about kind of like the short-term focus of a lot of elites, both in business as well as the political leaders. But I think that so far, as far as the tension between the United States and China has tried to, I think, to have a more long-term view and not respond to, you know, a lot of provocations like the tariffs,
Right.
you know, being imposed in a harsh way. And so hopefully that in the long term will, you know, as we get more used to, I think, discoveries in other countries and other people taking a lead, that that we can work together more.
Does this involve these kinds of large-scale global interactions, potential conflicts? Does it change much at the very local level, like in Chinatown, and how people feel in the Chinese community? What's your sense of how these big, sort of threatening, saber-rattling noises against China are translated?
No, I think there's a lot of fear in Chinatown among certain sectors right now. Like, for example, it was only since I mentioned, since I got active, that actually, actually it took a while before groups felt comfortable to celebrate the country. So the October 1st celebrations, which many other immigrants celebrate the foundation of their country and so on. But I think during the recent celebration, I noticed that certain organizations have pulled out because they're afraid of openly associating themselves with China. And as I mentioned, that trial of that worker who was accused of spying for China has also intimidated a lot of people, that they won't go to events. And it's also true for a lot of, we have a very large international student.
Yes.
And a lot of them will not get involved in activities.
They're very, very cautious.
Yeah, very cautious.
It's, I don't know what the number is this year, but it's usually 320,000 across the United States.
Yeah, yeah.
And they pay a lot of money into the US economy because they don't get a break.
Right. I think the universities, that and I guess the threat to the Department of Education, it's going to be very difficult for universities, and we have so many universities here in the local area. It's going to be tough.
It is going to be tough, hopefully not hopeless. And I must say that there have been very welcoming signs of positive interactions. For example, last year, I think it was one of the October festivals and celebrations in Chinatown. I was pleasantly surprised at the large number of non-Chinese people who were there to watch the dragons and the dances and so on. So maybe that's also part of just encouraging people to recognise the culture and celebrate the diversity.
Yeah, I hope so. And then food's always a good thing, and I think that Chinese food is pretty good.
Chinese food.
Well, that's an introduction to the culture.
That's true. Very good. What is your favourite, or what is your preferred Chinese food?
Well, the early immigrants, of which I'm, part of, we have very down-home, peasant type of Southern Chinese food. But recently, with some of these new Chinese restaurants, which have regional Chinese cuisines, I've begun to appreciate those a lot. So I'm trying to figure out how I stand on the food nowadays.
All right, great. Well, that's a good place to end. I'm just about ready for dinner anyway.
Okay.
Maybe we should find a good Chinese restaurant to go and celebrate. Thank you, Michael, very much for your contributions and for helping us understand.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me.
You're welcome.
I appreciate the chance to talk to your viewers.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, that's all from us, or from me, and from Michael, from Boston Media Theory, and from me, Marcus Breen. Until next time, keep on mediaing.